June 20th, 1984. A Thursday night that started with poker chips and ended with 8 bodies cooling on concrete that still smelled like citrus fruit and diesel fuel. The old Sunbright packing house on County Road 17, Highlands County, Florida. A place where oranges used to get sorted, packed, and shipped north. That night, it became something else entirely. 8 men walked in expecting cards and whiskey. Not one of them walked out alive. The shooters? 2 brothers, Mark and Eric Davis. They came prepared with enough ammunition to fight a small war, and the kind of cold determination that only comes from watching your father die in the dirt while everything your family built for 3 generations gets stolen through paperwork and handshakes behind closed doors. The FBI would call it the most methodical rural execution in Florida history. But here's what makes this story different from your typical crime documentary. This wasn't about drugs running up from Miami. Wasn't cartel violence, wasn't even organized crime in the traditional sense. This was about water, about $175,000 in manufactured debt, about irrigation rights stolen through county bureaucracy, about a 67-year-old man dying of heat stroke trying to save orange trees that his grandfather planted in 1927. Welcome to Highlands County, Florida, summer of 1984. Population hovering around 47,000 souls, scattered between citrus groves and cattle ranches that stretch across 1,028 square miles of what they call the Ridge. Not mountains, mind you, just the highest point in Peninsula Florida, maybe 300 feet above sea level, which passes for altitude, in a state that's basically a really aggressive sandbar with delusions of grandeur. The town of Sebring sits at the county seat. Population may be 8,000 if you count generously and include the folks who only show up for winter. This is old Florida. Not the Florida of Miami Vice and cocaine cowboys, not the Florida of Disney World and tourists in Mickey Mouse ears. This is the Florida that existed before air conditioning made the place habitable for people who weren't born sweating. June in Central Florida feels like breathing through hot soup. Temperatures hit 94 degrees by noon and stay there until sunset brings it down to maybe 82 if you're lucky. The humidity hovers around 85%. Sweat starts before you finish your morning coffee. The air smells like orange blossoms mixed with sulfur from the processing plants, with underlying notes of manure from the cattle ranches and that particular scent of wet earth that never quite dries out. Afternoon thunderstorms roll in like clockwork around 3 p.m. Biblical downpours that last 45 minutes and change nothing about the heat. Then, the sun comes back out and turns everything into a sauna. Mosquitoes the size of hummingbirds work in organized squadrons. Fire ants build mounds that'll put a grown man on his back if he steps wrong. Water moccasins cruise the irrigation ditches. This is not gentle country, but the orange groves. Man, the orange groves in 1984 were something else. Row after row of trees stretching to the horizon, dark green leaves and bright fruit creating patterns that looked like God's own geometry. Valencia oranges mostly, with some Hamlin and pineapple varieties mixed in. Trees planted in perfectly straight lines, branches heavy with fruit, irrigation systems running like clockwork when the water rights weren't being stolen by bureaucrats with side deals. The citrus industry in Central Florida wasn't just an industry, it was the industry. Entire towns existed because of oranges. Fortunes were made or lost based on freezes, droughts, and whether your trees produced good fruit or bad. A man with 500 acres of healthy groves? That man had generational wealth. That man had something worth killing for, or dying for. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to this channel. But I'm warning you right now, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events, explores themes of systematic corruption and the complete failure of legal systems, and asks uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and what happens when ordinary men get pushed past every reasonable limit. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. 1984 was a complicated year to be alive in America. Ronald Reagan was cruising toward his landslide re-election, telling everyone it was morning in America again. The economy was recovering from the brutal recession of the early 80s. Interest rates were finally coming down from Volcker's 20% nightmare. On TV, people were watching Miami Vice and drinking wine coolers and buying their first VCRs. But that recovery? It looked real different depending on where you stood. In New York and California, stockbrokers were making more money than God. In Central Florida's Citrus Belt, families who'd worked the same land for generations were watching their livelihoods circle the drain. The citrus industry was getting squeezed from every direction. Brazilian imports were flooding the market, undercutting prices. The big corporate operations, your Minute Maid and Tropicana, were consolidating, squeezing out family growers, processing plants were closing, packing houses were going dark, and the small family operations that had sustained Central Florida since before the Civil War were discovering that 3 generations of hard work could disappear in a single bad season. Then there was the water situation. See, in Florida, water isn't just water. It's property, it's wealth, it's everything. You can own 1,000 acres of the best citrus land in the state, but if you don't have water rights, you've got exactly nothing. Orange trees need irrigation, regular, measured, dependable water flowing through your groves from April through October when the rain doesn't cooperate. The bureaucracy controlling water rights in 1984 was a beautiful machine if you were the type of person who appreciates corruption. The Southwest Florida Water Management District, local county water boards, environmental regulations, agricultural exemptions, layers upon layers of permits and permissions and approvals, all controlled by men making $28,000 a year in government salaries while driving brand new Cadillacs and taking vacations in the Bahamas. It was the perfect system for predators. You find a family operation that's struggling. Maybe they missed a permit renewal or forgot to file some paperwork, and you manufacture a crisis. Suddenly, their water allocation gets redistributed to a corporate farm that just happens to be run by the cousin of the county water director. The family's trees start dying, the bank starts circling, and 6 months later, that land gets sold at auction for pennies on the dollar. Legal? Technically, yes. Ethical? Not even close. But in 1984, in Highlands County, Florida, if you tried to fight it, you'd discover real quick that the system wasn't designed to help you. It was designed to process you, to grind you down until you accepted your fate and moved on. The underground poker economy in Central Florida existed in the spaces where law enforcement decided not to look. County officials, water district managers, agricultural inspectors, real estate developers. They'd gather every week or two, play cards, drink bourbon, and conduct the real business of the county. The business that never appeared in official records. The business that determined whose groves lived and whose died. Highlands County Sheriff's Department in 1984 consisted of maybe 50 deputies covering over 1,000 square miles. They were stretched thin, underpaid, and in some cases actively participating in the corruption. Not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but enough. Enough that if you needed help, you couldn't be sure you weren't asking the exact wrong person. The game at the old Sunbright packing house ran twice a month, always on Thursday nights. Stakes high enough to matter, not so high you'd attract state attention. Buy-in was $500, which kept out the casual players. These were serious men playing serious poker with serious money, and everyone understood that what was said at the table stayed at the table. It was the kind of game where a county water director could sit across from the family farmer whose water rights he'd just stolen, and everyone would smile and shuffle the cards like nothing was wrong. Because that's how the system worked. Clean hands, dirty money, and the understanding that if you played the game right, you'd never face consequences. Until someone decided consequences were overdue. Until someone decided that when the legal system is broken, sometimes you have to reach for an older kind of justice. The kind that involves a Ruger rifle and a reckoning that can't be appealed. Mark Christopher Davis turned 36 years old on March 14, 1984, 3 months before everything went to hell. He stood just over 6 feet tall, lean and weathered in the way men get when they spend their entire adult lives working under the Florida sun. His hands were scarred from citrus thorns and chemical burns from pesticides. His forearms carried the kind of definition you can't get from a gym, only from years of physical labor that never stops. There was a scar across his left temple from a branch that snapped wrong during pruning season in 1976. Cost him 8 stitches and a permanent reminder to watch overhead. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, with crow's feet etched deep from squinting against sun glare, reflecting off white sand. He had his mother's smile, though by 1984 he didn't use it much anymore. Mark was an agronomist by education, a citrus specialist by profession, and a caretaker by nature. He'd gone to the University of Florida on a partial agriculture scholarship in 1966, graduated in 1970 with a degree in horticultural science, focused on citrus production. Could tell you about soil pH and irrigation timing and the 17 different diseases that could kill an orange tree. Could walk through a grove and know exactly which trees were healthy, which were struggling, and which needed to be cut before they infected their neighbors. But formal education only got you so far. The real knowledge came from his father, Charles, and his grandfather, William, before that. 3 generations of Davis men who understood that growing citrus wasn't just science. It was art. It was intuition. It was the ability to read a tree the way some men read the stock market, understanding what it needed before it showed obvious signs of distress. Mark's daily routine started at 5:30 a.m. summer and winter both. First cup of coffee on the back porch of the old farmhouse that his grandfather built in 1934, watching dawn break over the groves. The house sat on a slight rise, gave you a view across 500 acres of Valencia orange trees stretching east toward Lake Istokpoga. In the good years, before 1983, that view was money in the bank. Each tree producing maybe 400 pounds of fruit annually, 100 trees per acre, do the math. He'd do a morning inspection walk, checking irrigation lines, looking for signs of disease or pest damage, making notes in the small leather journal he carried everywhere. Then breakfast, usually just toast and more coffee because he never had much appetite in the morning. By 7 a.m. he was working. Could be pruning, could be overseeing the spraying schedule, could be dealing with the endless bureaucratic paperwork that came with running a commercial citrus operation. Mark never married. Came close once, girl named Sandra Miller from Sebring, but she wanted to move to Tampa and he couldn't leave the Groves. That was 1974. She married a car dealer, had 3 kids, probably lived a much easier life than she would have had with Mark. He didn't regret the choice, not exactly. But some nights the house felt bigger than it needed to be. What defined Mark more than anything was his sense of responsibility, not just to the Groves or the family legacy, but to the idea that there was a right way to do things. You honored your contracts, you paid your debts, you kept your word even when it cost you. You stood up for family, always, without question or hesitation. His father, Charles, used to tell a story about Mark at age 7, getting into a fight with a 12-year-old who'd been bullying Eric. Kid had 60 pounds on Mark and 3 years of experience. Mark took a beating that left him with a black eye and split lip, but he didn't back down until the older kid gave up and walked away. That was Mark. Didn't matter if he won or lost. What mattered was showing up. By spring of 1984, that sense of duty was being tested in ways Mark never anticipated. The thing about honor is it only works if the other guy believes in it too. Mark Davis built his entire life on the assumption that the world operated on certain principles. You worked hard, you played fair, you followed the rules, and the system protected you. That's what America was supposed to be. That's what his father and grandfather believed. That's what Mark believed right up until the moment the belief became impossible to maintain. The Davis family had owned the same 500 acres since 1927. Mark's grandfather William bought it with money saved from 10 years working other people's groves, back when Central Florida was still frontier country and a determined man with a strong back could build something permanent. He planted the first trees himself, Valencia oranges primarily, row after row of small saplings that would take 8 years to produce their first real crop. Water rights came with the original land purchase. This was 1927, before the complex bureaucracy, before the regulations, when a deed gave you the land and everything under it and the right to irrigate from the aquifer that ran underneath. Simple, clear, permanent, or so everyone thought. The Groves prospered through the Depression, through World War II, through the post-war boom. William passed them to his son Charles in 1958. Charles expanded the operation, modernized the irrigation, added 200 acres in 1964. By 1980, the Davis Groves were producing 450,000 pounds of oranges annually, generating maybe 180,000 in revenue during good years. Not wealthy by corporate standards, but solid. generational, secure. Then Charles got sick. Happened fast the way these things sometimes do. Started with persistent cough in fall of 1982, turned into something worse by Christmas. Doctor visits, x-rays, finally a diagnosis in February 1983, silicosis. Lung scarring from decades of breathing pesticide dust and spray drift. Not immediately fatal, but progressive, irreversible. Makes every breath harder, makes every day harder. The medical bills started piling up. Insurance covered some, not nearly enough. By summer of 1983, Charles was looking at $45,000 in debt, with more accumulating monthly. The groves were producing, but citrus farming operates on annual cycles. You plant, you tend, you harvest, you sell, you pay the bills. Money comes in November through March during harvest season. Bills come due year-round. Enter Walter Kimbrell. 44 years old, director of the Highlands County Water Management Office since 1979. Bald except for a ring of gray hair, wore wire-rimmed glasses and short-sleeved dress shirts with sweat stains under the arms. Drove a 1983 Lincoln Continental that cost more than his annual $32,000 county salary. Lived in a house worth $175,000 in a county where the median home price was $48,000. Everyone knew Walter was making money somewhere, but nobody asked questions, because asking questions made you the next target. Walter approached Charles in September 1983 with a solution. The County Water Management Office had access to an emergency agricultural fund designed to help family farmers through temporary crises. Charles could borrow $50,000 at 8% interest, very reasonable for 1983. There was paperwork, naturally, standard agricultural loan documents. Charles, sick and desperate and trusting, signed everything Walter put in front of him. The truth was buried in Section 7, subsection C, paragraph 4. Written in language that required a legal degree to parse. The loan wasn't a loan. It was a restructuring of the Davis family's water rights, converting their permanent historical allocation into a temporary annual permit, contingent on continuous compliance with county regulations. Any violation, real or manufactured, would result in immediate revocation and transfer of rights to the county for redistribution to agricultural operations in better compliance standing. Eric James Davis was built different from his brother, literally and metaphorically. 5 years younger at 31, he stood 5'10", maybe 190 pounds of compact muscle packed onto a frame that suggested their mother's side of the family more than their father's. Where Mark was lean and angular, Eric was solid, built like the machinery he spent his life repairing. His hands were permanently stained with grease that never quite washed out. Fingernails black-edged, knuckles scarred from slipped wrenches and close encounters with engine blocks. He worked as a heavy equipment mechanic at Patterson's Agricultural Services, the main repair shop in Highlands County for tractors, irrigation pumps, and the specialized machinery that kept the citrus industry running. Brought home maybe $320 a week, good money for 1984 rural Florida. Eric had his father's easy temperament, the ability to find humor in situations that would make other men angry. Where Mark was serious and contained, Eric could crack jokes, tell stories, make friends with strangers inside of 5 minutes. But underneath the laid-back exterior was the same Davis family steel, the same absolute loyalty, the same line you didn't cross without facing consequences. He'd graduated high school in 1971, tried junior college for a year, discovered he had no patience for academic abstraction when he could be taking things apart and putting them back together. Dropped out, got a job at Patterson's as a basic mechanic, worked his way up through natural aptitude and relentless dedication. By 1984, Eric was the guy other mechanics called when they couldn't figure something out. Could diagnose engine problems by sound, could rebuild a transmission in 4 hours that would take normal mechanics a full day. Eric married young, age 24, to a girl named Jennifer Walsh from 2 counties over. By 1984, they had 2 kids, a boy named Michael, who just turned 5, and a girl named Sarah, who was 3. They lived in a rental house in Sebring, 3-bedroom concrete block construction, $275 a month, which was stretching the budget but manageable if both incomes stayed steady. Jennifer worked part-time as a receptionist at a medical office, bringing in another $180 a week. Between them, they were making it work. Not wealthy, not struggling, just living the normal American working-class life of the mid-1980s. Mortgage was still a dream, but they were saving. 5 more years and maybe they could afford a down payment on a small place. The American dream, deferred, but not abandoned. The Davis brothers weren't particularly close as kids. 5 years is a big age gap when you're young. Mark was already driving when Eric started middle school. But Vietnam changed things. Mark got draft notice in 1970, served 14 months including 7 in country, came back in 1972 with the same body but different eyes. Something had shifted, something hard to name but impossible to miss. Eric was 17 when Mark came home, saw his brother struggling with sleep, with sudden noises, with crowds. Didn't understand it, didn't need to. Just knew Mark needed someone to sit with him some nights when the darkness got too thick. So Eric did. Drove out to the family house, sat on the porch, didn't talk much, just was there. Sometimes that's all brotherhood requires. Presence. By 1984, they'd developed the kind of relationship that doesn't need constant contact to maintain depth. Eric would come out to the Groves most Sundays, help with whatever needed doing, catch up on family business. Mark would stop by Eric's house on his way through Sebring, have dinner with the family, play with his nephew and niece. Simple, solid, the foundation you build a life on. Eric noticed the change in his father first. Charles had always been vital, energetic, the kind of man who seemed perpetually in motion. But through 1983 into 1984, he was slowing down, breathing harder, moving carefully like every step cost more than it used to. Mark explained it was the silicosis, the lung damage, nothing that could be fixed, but nothing immediately fatal either. They'd manage it. They'd figure it out. What Mark didn't tell Eric, at least not initially, was the extent of the financial crisis, the debt, the paperwork Charles had signed, the trap that was closing. Mark carried that burden alone until it became too heavy, until he needed to share it with someone who would understand. Someone who wouldn't judge, someone who would stand with him regardless of where that stand led. April 1984. Charles Davis started noticing problems with the irrigation system. The main pump station that fed water from the aquifer into the distribution network was running inconsistently, pressure dropping, flow rates decreasing. At first he thought it was mechanical failure, normal wear and tear after 20 years of operation. Called Eric to take a look. Eric spent 3 days diagnosing the system, checked the pump motor, examined the valves, tested the pressure sensors. Everything was functioning correctly. The problem wasn't mechanical. The problem was the water allocation itself was being reduced at the source, throttled back at the county management level. Mark made calls. Started with the county water office, spoke with a junior clerk who promised someone would get back to him. Nobody did. Called again a week later, got transferred 4 times, finally reached a supervisor who claimed there was no record of any allocation changes. Must be a mistake in the metering system, would send someone to check. Nobody came. By mid-May, sections of the Groves were showing stress. Orange trees can handle short-term water reduction, but not sustained deprivation. Leaves starting to yellow. Fruit production declining. Mark walked the property every morning, watching 175,000 worth of trees slowly dying while bureaucracy moved at its characteristic pace, which is to say, not at all. 3rd week of May, a letter arrived, official county letterhead, signed by Walter Kimbrell himself. Notification that the Davis family agricultural operation was in violation of permit compliance regarding water usage documentation. Specifically, failure to file quarterly usage reports for Q4, 1983 and Q1, 1984. This violation triggered an automatic review of their water rights allocation pending resolution of documentation deficiencies. Mark read the letter 3 times, each reading making his blood pressure climb. They'd filed every quarterly report, had copies of everything, certified mail receipts proving delivery. This was manufactured. This was designed. But proving it would require lawyers, time, and money they didn't have. He drove to the county office next day, brought a folder 6 inches thick with documentation. Waited 4 hours before getting a 10-minute meeting with Walter Kimbrell. Walter listened politely, examined the documents, explained that the county's records showed no receipt of those reports. Perhaps they were lost in the mail. These things happen. The violation stood. However, there was a solution available. The solution: the Davis family could voluntarily surrender their historical water rights in exchange for a new annual permit allocation at reduced levels. This would clear the violation, restore irrigation, and allow continued agricultural operation. Alternative: maintain the violation dispute, proceed to administrative hearing, face potential complete loss of water rights during the appeal process, which typically took 18 to 24 months. Mark understood immediately. This wasn't about missing reports or bureaucratic errors. This was about stealing the family's water rights using the system as a weapon. The reports were never lost. They were destroyed. The violation was manufactured, and the solution was designed to force surrender while making it look voluntary. He asked Walter directly, "What happens to our original water rights after we surrender them?" Walter smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. They get redistributed according to county policy to agricultural operations, demonstrating superior compliance and contributing to regional economic development. Translation: to whoever paid Walter the biggest bribe. Mark left that office knowing several things with absolute certainty. 1. His father had been trapped through desperation and paperwork. 2. The legal system wasn't going to help because the trap was legal. 3. Walter Kimbrell was going to steal everything the Davis family had built for 3 generations. 4. The people who were supposed to protect citizens from exactly this kind of predatory corruption were either unable or unwilling to intervene. He drove home in silence, that particular kind of silence where you're having arguments with yourself about what's possible and what's necessary. Pulled into the driveway at sunset, found his father sitting on the back porch, oxygen tank beside him, watching the groves that were slowly dying from manufactured thirst. Charles looked up when Mark approached. Didn't need to ask how the meeting went. Could read it on his son's face. June in Central Florida isn't just hot. It's biblical. The kind of heat that makes you understand why the early Spanish explorers took one look at this peninsula and said, "Maybe we'll come back in November." But citrus doesn't wait for comfortable weather. Trees that need water need it now, regardless of whether it's 96 degrees with humidity that makes the air feel solid. Charles Davis spent the first 2 weeks of June 1984 trying everything he could think of to save his groves. The water allocation had been cut to maybe 40% of normal levels, enough to keep the trees from dying immediately, not enough to sustain fruit production or long-term health. It was death by degrees, designed to force surrender without creating the kind of dramatic crisis that might attract unwanted attention. He filed appeals, wrote letters to the county commission, to the state agricultural department, to his congressman's office, got polite responses that said nothing and promised less. We'll look into it. These processes take time. Have you considered retaining legal counsel? Every response a variation of, "You're on your own." Mark suggested they hire a lawyer, fight this properly through the courts. Charles resisted. Lawyers cost money they didn't have. Besides, he'd signed the paperwork. He'd trusted Walter Kimbrell. He'd believed that a county official wouldn't deliberately destroy a family farm. The shame of that naivety ate at Charles worse than the disease in his lungs. Eric offered to loan money from his and Jennifer's savings. Charles refused, not taking money from his kids, not putting Eric's young family at risk. Pride, maybe. Or the last stand of a man who'd built his identity on being the provider, the protector, the one who solved problems instead of creating them. The trees kept dying, slowly, visibly, row by row. Valencia oranges that should have been swelling toward harvest were dropping prematurely, leaves turning brown at the edges, bark showing stress patterns. Mark walked the groves every day documenting the damage, taking photographs, building a record that might matter if they ever got their day in court. Knowing that court was 18 months away, minimum, and the trees would be dead in 6. Charles couldn't stop going out there. Even on days when the heat index hit 110, when the humidity made every breath feel like drowning, he'd insist on doing his inspection rounds. Mark would try to stop him. "Dad, I can handle it. You need to rest. The heat's not good for your lungs." Charles would wave him off. "Been walking these groves since before you were born, not stopping now." What Charles couldn't articulate, what he maybe didn't fully understand himself, was that stopping felt like surrender, like admitting that Walter Kimbrell had won. That 70 years of Davis family history was ending because Charles made one mistake, signed one document, trusted one corrupt bureaucrat. The Groves were dying, but as long as Charles kept walking them, kept checking on them, kept treating them like they had a future, then maybe there was still hope. By mid-June, Charles was sleeping maybe 3 hours a night. The oxygen tank couldn't keep up with his deteriorating lungs. The stress and heat were accelerating the silicosis. Mark could see his father shrinking, literally growing smaller as the weight fell off, as the illness consumed him from inside. They had a conversation on June 15th, a Friday evening, sitting on the back porch watching sunset paint the dying groves in shades of gold and red that would have been beautiful if they didn't represent catastrophe. Charles broke down in a way Mark had never seen. Not crying exactly, just defeated. Voice hoarse from damaged lungs and accumulated grief. "I lost it, Mark. Everything your grandfather built, everything I was supposed to protect and pass on to you and Eric. Lost it because I was stupid enough to trust a man in a county office who wore a tie and said he wanted to help." He paused, fighting for breath. "You know what the worst part is? It was legal. He didn't break any laws. He just used the laws like weapons. And I walked right into it because I thought the system protected people like us." Mark didn't know what to say, didn't have words that would make this better. Just sat there with his father while darkness settled over 500 acres of orange trees that would be gone before harvest season. Sunday, June 17th, 1984. Father's Day. The temperature hit 97 degrees by 11 a.m., humidity at 88%, heat index pushing 115. The kind of day where weather services issue warnings telling people to stay indoors, stay hydrated, avoid physical exertion. The kind of day where the smart move is to sit in air conditioning and wait for sunset. Charles Davis woke at dawn, made coffee, sat on the porch watching the sun come up. Mark found him there at 6:30, already dressed for work, already planning his day. "Dad, it's Sunday. It's Father's Day. Eric and Jennifer are coming for lunch. You need to rest." Charles shook his head. "Trees don't care what day it is. Section 7 has some young Valencias that might pull through if we can get them more water. Want to check the irrigation manifold, see if we can adjust the distribution." They argued about it for 20 minutes, Mark trying to be gentle but firm, Charles getting more agitated, more insistent, finally compromising that they'd go out together, do a quick check, be back by 10 before the heat became dangerous. Just a father and son walking their land one more time. They took the old F-150 down the access roads between rows of trees. Charles directed, Mark drove. The groves looked worse every day. Trees that had stood 30, 40, 50 years, showing stress that would take years to recover from if the water came back tomorrow. Which it wouldn't. At Section 7, Charles insisted on getting out, doing a physical inspection of the irrigation system. Mark led him, hovering nearby, watching for signs of distress. They checked 6 trees, examined the manifold, confirmed what Mark already knew, which was that the system was functioning fine, but the water pressure from the main line was inadequate because the county had throttled their allocation. 9:47 a.m. Charles was standing next to a 40-year-old Valencia, hand on the trunk, talking to it the way farmers sometimes talk to plants, telling it to hold on, promising water was coming, apologizing for failing it. Then he stopped mid-sentence, looked confused, tried to speak and couldn't, put his hand to his chest. Mark caught him as he collapsed, lowered him to the ground. Charles's skin was frighteningly hot, fever-dry. His pulse was racing, weak and thready. Heatstroke, severe, immediate, life-threatening. Mark ran for the truck, grabbed the water jug, poured it over his father's head and chest, trying to cool him down. Started the truck, got Charles in the passenger seat, drove as fast as the rough access road allowed toward the main house, called 911 at 10:03 a.m. Ambulance dispatched from Sebring, estimated arrival 35 minutes because they had to come from the hospital and navigate county roads. Mark kept pouring water over his father, tried to get him to drink, monitored his breathing, which was getting shallower, more labored. Called Eric. Dad collapsed. Heat stroke. "Ambulance coming, but you need to get here now." Eric was halfway through Sunday breakfast with his family. Told Jennifer to stay with the kids, drove 90 miles an hour down Highway 27, made the 20-minute drive in 12. The ambulance arrived at 10:38. EMTs worked fast, professional, got Charles on a gurney, started IV fluids, loaded him into the ambulance. Mark and Eric followed in Mark's truck to Highlands Regional Medical Center. Spent 4 hours in a waiting room that smelled like disinfectant and anxiety while doctors did what they could. Charles never regained consciousness. The combination of extreme heat, severe dehydration, and pre-existing lung damage had triggered a cascade of system failures, kidneys shutting down, core temperature that peaked at 107.3 degrees before they got it under control, brain damage from hyperthermia. Even if they saved him, he wouldn't be the same person. Dr. Patricia Morrison came out at 2:47 p.m., 67 years old, been practicing in Highlands County for 30 years, delivered both Mark and Eric. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "I'm very sorry. Your father passed at 2:32. We did everything we could. The damage was just too extensive." She explained the medical details, the sequence of failures, the point where intervention became impossible. Mark heard maybe half of it. Eric heard none of it. They sat there in plastic chairs while Dr. Morrison talked, and the world continued spinning like nothing had changed, like Charles Davis hadn't just stopped existing. They went in to see the body. Charles looked smaller than he had that morning, peaceful, which was something. His last words that Mark could remember were promises to a dying tree that the water would come back, that everything would be okay. Lies told to an orange tree because Charles couldn't bear to admit defeat. Mark stood there looking at his father's body and felt something shift inside him. Not grief, not yet. Grief would come later. This was colder, clearer. The absolute certainty that Charles Davis had been murdered, not with a gun or a knife, but with paperwork and bureaucracy and legal theft. Walter Kimbrell killed him as surely as if he'd put hands around Charles's throat and squeezed, and the law would call it heatstroke. An unfortunate accident. These things happen to old men in the Florida summer. No charges filed, no investigation opened, just another family farm dying, another elderly farmer gone, another generation watching their inheritance disappear into corruption that wore a suit and tie. Eric finally spoke. Voice flat, empty. "We need to call the funeral home. Mom's buried at Garden of Peace. He'll want to be there. The practical details of death. What you focus on, because focusing on anything else means confronting the howling void of loss." They handled it, made calls, filed paperwork, went through the motions, drove back to the family house as sunset painted the dying groves in colors that would have been beautiful in any other context, sat on the porch where Charles had sat that morning drinking coffee and planning his day. Mark spoke first. "Walter Kimbrell killed him, as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger. Dad died trying to save trees that were being deliberately killed to force us off our land. That's murder. Might not fit the legal definition, but it's murder." Eric didn't argue, just nodded. "What do we do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What do you do when your father gets killed through legal means, when the system that's supposed to protect you is the weapon being used against you? When every official channel has failed and the courts will take years you don't have? When the man responsible will face exactly 0 consequences because he never technically broke any laws? They sat there in silence as darkness settled over Central Florida. Two brothers on a porch, processing grief and rage, and the terrible calculus of what justice means when the law has completely failed. Monday, June 18th, the day after Father's Day, the day after Charles Davis died. Mark and Eric spent it handling logistics, called the funeral home, selected a casket that cost more than they could afford but was the last thing they'd ever do for their father. Arranged for viewing on Tuesday, funeral on Wednesday. Kept it simple because Charles would have wanted simple. Jennifer came by with the kids. Michael and Sarah were too young to really understand death, just knew Grandpa was gone and everyone was sad. Sarah asked when Grandpa was coming back. Nobody had a good answer for that. Eric held his daughter while she cried about something she didn't fully comprehend, and the weight of what he was considering made him feel physically sick. The extended family started arriving. Charles had a younger sister in Tampa, 2 cousins in Georgia, scattered relatives who showed up for weddings and funerals. They brought casseroles and condolences and stories about Charles's better days. Everyone agreed it was such a shame. So tragic. Heat stroke is terrible. At least he didn't suffer long. All the platitudes people offer when they don't know what else to say. Nobody mentioned Walter Kimbrell. Nobody talked about the water rights theft. Nobody acknowledged that Charles Davis died trying to save a legacy that corrupt bureaucrats were deliberately destroying. Either they didn't know or they didn't want to know. Easier to pretend it was just bad luck and unfortunate timing. Tuesday brought the viewing. Open casket at Garden of Peace Memorial Chapel. Charles looked strange in a suit, peaceful but artificial, like someone had created a wax sculpture that didn't quite capture the original. Maybe 80 people came through over 4 hours. Neighbors, friends from church, men Charles had worked with over the decades. Everyone signed the guest book and said appropriate things and left, probably relieved they could return to their own lives. Mark stood by the casket greeting people, accepting handshakes and hugs, saying thank you for coming maybe 300 times, until the words lost all meaning. Eric stood beside him, present but distant, mind clearly somewhere else. They didn't discuss what they were thinking. Didn't need to. Brotherhood sometimes works on frequencies below language. After the viewing ended, after everyone left, after Jennifer took the kids home and the extended family went to their hotels, Mark and Eric stayed behind. Just the two of them in the empty chapel with their father's body and the decision that had been forming since Sunday afternoon. Eric spoke first. I've been thinking about it, about what comes next, about Walter Kimbrell. He paused, choosing words carefully. The law isn't going to touch him. Best case, we file a civil suit, spend 3 years in court, maybe win a settlement that won't bring Dad back or save the Groves. Worst case, we lose everything trying to fight a system designed to protect men like him. Mark nodded. I know. So what are we talking about here? What are you thinking? Eric's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking slightly. Not fear, exactly. Just recognition of the gravity of the conversation they were having. Mark turned away from the casket, looked directly at his brother. Thursday night, Sunbright Packing House. Kimbrell runs a poker game there twice a month. Next game is June 20th. High-stakes game, county officials and the people who profit from their corruption. That's where he'll be. You're talking about killing him. Eric said it as a statement, not a question. I'm talking about justice when the legal system has completely failed. I'm talking about making sure the man who killed our father faces consequences. Mark's voice was calm, frighteningly calm. I'm talking about the fact that if we do nothing, Walter Kimbrell wins. He keeps stealing from families, keeps using the system as a weapon, keeps living his comfortable life while people like Dad die in the dirt trying to save what's theirs. Eric was quiet for a long moment. You know where this goes, right? We do this, we're done. Prison, probably for life. My kids grow up without a father. Jennifer loses her husband. Your Groves get sold anyway. We sacrifice everything and it doesn't even save the farm. I know. So why? What's the point? Mark looked back at the casket. Because some things matter more than consequences. Because Dad died believing he failed us. Died thinking he lost everything because he was naive enough to trust a system that's supposed to protect citizens. I can't give him back his life. I can't save the Groves, but I can make sure Walter Kimbrell doesn't walk away clean. I can make sure there's a price for what he did. Wednesday morning, the funeral. Garden of Peace. Cemetery, plot adjacent to where their mother rested. Pastor Williams from First Methodist gave the eulogy, hit all the standard notes about Charles being a good man, a hard worker, devoted to family. Probably said the same things at every funeral. Didn't matter. The words weren't for Charles anyway. They were for the living, the attempt to make sense of loss through ritual. Burial at 11 a.m. Temperature already climbing toward the mid-90s. They lowered Charles Davis into the ground while cicadas screamed in the oak trees and the sun beat down on mourners in uncomfortable clothes. Eric's kids threw flowers on the casket like Jennifer had taught them. Sarah asked again when Grandpa was coming back. Nobody tried to answer this time. After, there was lunch at the fellowship hall. More casseroles, more condolences, more well-meaning people who didn't understand what had really happened and probably wouldn't believe it if you told them. Mark and Eric went through the motions, played their roles, accepted sympathy from people who thought they were grieving an accident. By 4 p.m., everyone had gone. The family house was finally empty. Mark and Eric sat on the back porch with beers, neither of them drinking much, both of them thinking about tomorrow night. I'm with you, Eric said finally. Whatever you're planning, whatever it costs, I'm with you. That's what brothers do. Mark nodded. Didn't say thank you because Eric didn't need thanks. Just acknowledgement. We need to talk details. Who'll be there besides Kimbrel? How we get in, how we get out. Whether we're prepared to... He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Whether we're prepared to make sure there's no witnesses? That was the line, wasn't it? Killing Walter Kimbrel was one thing. Justified, maybe. Understandable, at least. But everyone else who'd be at that poker game? Some would be complicit in the corruption. Some would just be regular guys playing cards. Could they really gun down a room full of people, some innocent, some just in the wrong place? I don't know, Eric admitted. I've been thinking about it since Sunday. I can pull the trigger on Kimbrel without losing sleep. The others, he shook his head. But if we leave witnesses, we're in prison by Friday morning. Our lives are over either way. They sat with that truth as the sun set over 500 acres of dying orange trees that represented 3 generations of Davis family sweat and sacrifice and dreams that were ending whether they acted or not. Thursday, June 20th, 1984. The day dawned clear and brutally hot, temperature forecast to hit 98 degrees with humidity that would make it feel like 110. A normal summer day in central Florida. The kind of day where most people stay indoors, drink iced tea, wait for the afternoon thunderstorm to provide temporary relief. Mark Davis woke at his usual 5:30 a.m., made coffee, sat on the porch watching dawn break over groves that would belong to someone else soon, or to no one. Maybe they'd just bulldoze the trees, put up a shopping center or a housing development. 3 generations erased for a parking lot. That was progress in 1984 America. He didn't do his normal inspection walk, didn't see the point. Instead, he went to the gun cabinet in his father's study. Charles had been a hunter back when his lungs worked better and walking through the woods didn't leave him gasping. The collection was modest but well-maintained. A Ruger Mini 14.223 rifle, popular with ranchers and farmers because it was reliable and accurate. A Winchester Model 12 shotgun, 12-gauge pump action. A Smith & Wesson Model 19.357 Magnum revolver that Charles had bought in 1967 for home protection. Plus, Mark's own Colt 1911 .45 automatic that he'd carried in Vietnam and never quite been able to throw away. He cleaned each weapon methodically, broke them down, oiled the moving parts, checked the actions, reassembled them with the muscle memory that comes from doing something 1,000 times. The ritual was calming in a way, familiar, mechanical. Didn't require thinking about the implications of what he was preparing to do. Eric arrived around 9. Told Jennifer he was helping Mark sort through Charles's belongings, figure out estate issues. Not a complete lie. They were sorting through things, just not the things Jennifer imagined. They spread everything out on the kitchen table. 4 firearms, ammunition. Mark had 180 rounds for the Ruger, 40 shells for the shotgun, 60 rounds for the .357, 90 rounds for the .45. Eric looked at the inventory. Planning a small war? Planning for contingencies. We don't know how many people will be there. Don't know if anyone will be armed. Don't know if we'll face resistance or if this'll be over fast. Mark loaded magazines, his hands steady despite what they were discussing. Rather have too much ammunition than not enough. They talked through the plan again. They'd arrive around midnight after the game had been running a few hours, after people were relaxed and focused on cards. The old Sunbright packing house sat isolated, 100 yards off County Road 17, no nearby neighbors. Sound wouldn't travel far. Even gunshots might not attract immediate attention in rural Florida where people hunt year-round and nighttime shooting isn't unusual. The entrance was a single door on the south side, usually unlocked during game nights because players came and went. Sometimes there was a guard, sometimes not. If there was, they'd have to deal with him first. Fast, quiet if possible, loud if necessary. Inside was one large room, maybe 50 feet by 80 feet, concrete floor, high ceiling with exposed beams. The poker table usually set up in the center. Lights would be bright over the table, dim everywhere else. That was good. They could control the room from the entrance, have visual superiority, force everyone into the light while staying partially in shadow. Mark had called a contact, guy he knew from Vietnam who still had friends in the sheriff's department, asked casual questions about the poker games. Learned that they typically had between 8 and 12 players, plus Kimbrell, who ran the operation. No regular security beyond maybe one guy at the door. County officials felt safe there because everyone understood the protection racket. Local law enforcement looked the other way. Nobody had ever been arrested at one of these games. That safety was about to become a liability. They loaded the weapons into a canvas duffel bag that had U.S. Army stenciled on the side, a relic from Mark's service. Added a flashlight, zip ties in case they needed to restrain anyone, a first aid kit because going into a gunfight without medical supplies was stupid, regardless of your intentions. Eric kept glancing at his watch, fidgeting, the stress finally showing. "You sure about this? We walk through that door, there's no coming back. No changing our minds, no undoing what happens." Mark stopped what he was doing, looked directly at his brother. "I'm not sure about anything. I don't know if this is justice or murder. I don't know if we're heroes or villains. I don't know if Dad would approve or be horrified. What I know is that the system failed completely. Walter Kimbrell destroyed our family using laws that are supposed to protect people. And if we do nothing, he wins. He lives his comfortable life while Dad's buried, and the Groves die, and everything 3 generations built turns to dust." He paused, weighing his next words. "You don't have to do this. You have a wife, kids, a future. I'm already lost. Been lost since Vietnam, probably. But you can still walk away. Go home to Jennifer and Michael and Sarah. Live your life. I'll do this alone if I have to." Eric shook his head. "Dad was my father, too. Those Groves were going to be my inheritance, too. And besides, you think I'm letting my brother walk into something like this alone? We do this together, or we don't do it at all." They spent the afternoon in a strange limbo. Too keyed up to sleep, too distracted to do anything productive. Sat on the porch drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, not talking much, just existing in that space before everything changes forever. Around 4 p.m. they ate what might be their last free meal. Fried chicken and mashed potatoes, food that Charles used to make on Sundays. Tasted like sawdust, but they ate anyway because bodies need fuel, regardless of what minds are contemplating. At 6 p.m., Mark called Jennifer from Eric's request. Put Eric on the phone. Watched his brother tell his wife he loved her, tell his kids to be good for mommy, say goodbye without saying goodbye. When Eric hung up, his hands were shaking. Hardest thing I've ever done. 8 p.m. The sun finally set, bringing temperatures down to the low 80s, still hot but bearable. They loaded the duffel bag into Mark's truck, the same F-150 he'd been driving the day Charles collapsed, checked the weapons one final time, made sure they had everything they needed. 10 p.m. They were ready. As ready as 2 farmers can be to commit mass murder in the name of justice that the law wouldn't provide. Mark started the engine. Eric sat in the passenger seat, the duffel between his feet, staring straight ahead. "Last chance to change your mind," Mark said quietly. Eric didn't hesitate. "Drive." 11:47 p.m. The old Sunbright packing house sat dark against darker sky, a concrete block structure that had processed thousands of tons of oranges back when small packing operations could still compete with corporate facilities. Built in 1958, closed in 1979, sat mostly abandoned since then, except for the twice-monthly poker games that gave it purpose and kept the electricity running. Mark killed the headlights a quarter-mile out, let his eyes adjust to darkness before pulling into the dirt lot behind the building. 6 vehicles parked in a rough semicircle. Walter Kimbrell's Lincoln Continental, 2 pickup trucks, a Cadillac Seville, a Chevy Blazer, and an older Ford LTD. Not the full crowd the games sometimes drew, but enough. More than enough. They sat in the truck for 3 minutes, neither speaking, both processing what they were about to do. Through the single window on the south wall, you could see light, faint and yellow. Could hear voices, muffled but distinct. Laughter. Someone cursing about a bad hand. The ordinary sounds of men playing cards, completely unaware that the universe was about to tilt sideways. Mark opened the duffel, handed Eric the Winchester shotgun and the 357 revolver, took the Ruger rifle and the .45 automatic for himself. They loaded the weapons with the practiced efficiency of men who'd grown up around guns. Safety off on the Ruger, round chambered in the .45. The Winchester made that distinctive pump-action sound as Eric chambered a shell, incredibly loud in the quiet truck cab. "We go in fast," Mark whispered, though there was nobody to hear them. "I take the door. You follow immediately. We secure the room before anyone can react. Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt unnecessarily. But Mark," he paused, met his brother's eyes, "if they fight back, if anyone goes for a weapon, we don't hesitate. Understand?" Eric nodded. His face was pale in the darkness, but his hands were steady on the shotgun. "I understand." They exited the truck, moved toward the building in a crouch, though there was probably no need. The night was moonless, cloud cover blocking any ambient light. Crickets and tree frogs created a wall of sound that would cover their approach. Maybe 60 yards from the truck to the door, crossing open ground that used to be the loading area where citrus trucks would back up to receive pallets of packed fruit, 30 yards, 20, 10. They could hear voices more clearly now. Someone saying, "Raise you 50. Someone else, "You're bluffing, Walt. You always bluff when you got nothing." Walter Kimbrell's voice, recognizable from Mark's meeting at the county office. "Put your money where your mouth is then, Richard." 5 yards from the door. Mark noticed there was no guard outside. That was good. One less complication, one less person to deal with, one less soul on his conscience if he still had a conscience after tonight, which was increasingly doubtful. He reached the door. Old metal door, paint flaking, probably not locked because players came and went. Turned the handle slowly. It gave. Not locked. Mark looked back at Eric one final time. His brother gave a single nod. They'd come too far to turn back now. Had probably passed the point of no return days ago, maybe Sunday afternoon when they'd first started contemplating this. Maybe the moment Charles signed Walter Kimbrell's fraudulent paperwork. Maybe further back than that. Mark took 3 deep breaths, the way his drill sergeant had taught him before patrols in Vietnam. Center yourself. Control your breathing. Violence is just movement with purpose. Don't think, act. He kicked the door open hard. It slammed back against the interior wall with a crash that was somehow louder than he expected. Stepped through with the Ruger raised to shoulder level. Eric followed immediately, the Winchester tracking right, while Mark's rifle covered left. The room was exactly as described, 50 by 80 feet, concrete floor, high ceiling. Single overhead light fixture casting harsh shadows. Poker table in the center, covered in green felt, chips stacked in the middle, cards scattered where players had dropped them in surprise. 8 men. Mark's mind cataloged them in the 2 seconds before anyone could react. Walter Kimbrell at the head of the table, jaw dropping, cigar falling from his mouth. Richard Stone next to him, the county accountant who'd helped manipulate the books. George Crane, district attorney, who'd looked the other way on multiple corruption complaints. Paul Vickers, the water management clerk who'd lost the Davis family's paperwork. 4 others. Robert Hendricks owned an agricultural supply company. Thomas Morton, a real estate developer who'd made a fortune buying distressed farms. 2 men Mark didn't recognize, probably from other counties, just regular players at the wrong game. 2.5 seconds of frozen tableau. 8 men staring at 2 armed figures in the doorway. Nobody moving, nobody breathing. The moment stretching like taffy before snapping back to regular time. Mark spoke first. His voice was surprisingly steady, surprisingly calm, like he was discussing irrigation schedules instead of holding 8 men at gunpoint. "Nobody moves. Hands on the table where I can see them. Right now." Walter Kimbrell found his voice first. Always the politician, always trying to manage situations through words. "Mark? Mark Davis? What the hell do you think you're doing? Put the guns down before someone gets hurt. We can talk about this." "We're past talking, Walter. We tried talking, tried the legal system, tried every official channel. You murdered my father, maybe not directly, but you killed him as surely as if you'd put a gun to his head. You destroyed my family through corruption and paperwork. And now you're going to answer for it. The thing about pointing guns at people is that it creates a very specific kind of tension. Time moves differently. Every second expands. Every movement gets noticed. The human brain, evolved for survival, suddenly operates at maximum capacity, processing threats and options and possibilities at speeds conscious thought can't match. Walter Kimbrell was still trying to talk. "Mark, listen to me. Your father signed legal documents. I didn't force him. The courts would have— Mark cut him off. The courts? The courts would have taken 3 years while you hid behind procedures you manipulated. Save your speeches, Walter. They don't work anymore. George Crane, the district attorney, tried a different approach. His voice had the practiced authority of a man used to controlling courtrooms. Mark Davis, you are currently committing multiple felonies: armed burglary, aggravated assault, terroristic threats. Put the weapons down immediately and we can resolve this without anyone dying. Eric laughed, a sound without humor. Resolve it? Like you resolved all the complaints filed against Kimbrell? Like you resolved the corruption that's been eating this county for decades? You're part of the problem, George. You think we don't know that? One of the men Mark didn't recognize, heavy-set guy in a Florida Gators t-shirt, started to slowly reach toward his waistband. Maybe he had a weapon. Maybe he was just nervous. It didn't matter. Eric saw the movement, reacted instantly. Hands on the table! I said hands on the fucking table! The man jerked his hands up, palms forward. Okay. Jesus Christ, take it easy. Mark needed to establish control before the situation deteriorated into chaos. Everyone stand up, slowly. Keep your hands visible. Move away from the table, against the far wall, now. They complied, moving with the careful deliberation of people who understood their lives depended on not spooking the armed men controlling the room. All except Walter Kimbrell. He stayed seated, trying to project authority he no longer possessed. I'm not moving until you explain what you think this accomplishes. You shoot me, you go to prison for life. You shoot everyone here, you still go to prison. Your father's death was tragic, but it was heat stroke, natural causes. You can't— Mark crossed the distance between the door and the table in 4 strides, pressed the barrel of the Ruger against Walter Kimbrell's forehead, right between the eyes. Walter's face went from red to white in an instant. His bladder released. The stench of urine filled the air. Natural causes? Mark's voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow more terrifying than if he'd been screaming. My father died trying to save trees you were deliberately killing. Died of heat stroke because the stress of losing everything pushed him past his limits. You might not have pulled a trigger, but you killed him. And you knew exactly what you were doing. Walter was trembling now, all pretense of control gone. Please, Mark, I have a wife, I have kids. We can fix this. I'll return the water rights. I'll make it right. I'll give you anything you want. Please don't do this. For a moment, Mark hesitated. This was the line. Once crossed, everything changed forever. He could still walk away, could still choose prison for aggravated assault instead of life for murder, could still be the man his father raised instead of the man his father's death had created. Behind him, Eric's voice. Brother, if we don't finish this, we spend the rest of our lives in prison anyway, and men like Kimbrell keep destroying families. You know that. Mark knew, had known since Sunday. Had probably known longer than that, known the moment he read the fraudulent documents Walter had tricked Charles into signing. Some scales can only be balanced with blood. Some debts can only be paid in death. He stepped back from Walter Kimbrell, lowered the rifle slightly. Walter's face showed relief, hope, the belief that maybe he could still talk his way out of this. Then Mark raised the rifle again and fired. Single shot, center mass. The .223 round entered Walter Kimbrell's chest, exited through his back, embedded itself in the concrete wall beyond. Walter looked surprised more than anything else, looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, tried to speak but only blood came out. He fell forward onto the poker table, scattering chips and cards, dead before his face hit the felt. The room exploded into chaos, men screaming, crying, begging. Someone tried to run for the door. Eric fired the Winchester once, the shotgun blast deafening in the enclosed space, hit the runner in the legs, brought him down shrieking. Thomas Morton, the real estate developer, was praying loudly, crying, saying he didn't do anything. He was just here for cards. Please, God, please don't kill me. Mark felt nothing. Should have felt something. Guilt, horror, satisfaction, anything. But there was just emptiness. Mechanical precision, the thing inside him that made him human, had disconnected, leaving only the part that could function in combat, the part that Vietnam had created and civilian life had never quite erased. Line up against the wall. Everyone who had a part in stealing water rights, step forward." His voice was flat, emotionless, a machine processing tasks. Richard Stone stepped forward, the accountant, the man who'd cooked the books. "I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry. It was Walter's idea. I just did the paperwork. I have a daughter. She's 16, please." Paul Vickers, the water management clerk. "I'll testify. I'll tell everything I know. I'll make sure they investigate. Please, please let me make this right." George Crane, the district attorney, tried one more time to assert authority. "This is murder. Cold-blooded murder. You'll both get the death penalty. Is that what you want? To die for this?" Mark looked at him with eyes that had gone completely cold. "We're already dead, George. Died the moment you and Walter and Richard and all the rest of you corrupt sons of bitches decided that laws were weapons instead of protections. We're just making sure you die first." The next 15 minutes existed outside normal time. Later, forensic psychologists would analyze what happened in that packing house, trying to understand how two ordinary men could methodically execute 8 people. They'd use terms like dissociative state and moral disengagement and trauma-induced psychosis, all technical language trying to explain something fundamentally human and fundamentally terrible. What happens when decent people are pushed past every breaking point the world offers? Richard Stone was first, after Walter Kimbrell. The accountant who'd manipulated the books, created the paper trail that made theft look legal. He was still begging, tears streaming down his face, telling Mark about his daughter's upcoming birthday, about his wife's cancer treatment, about how he'd only done what Walter told him to do. Mark listened to all of it. Let him finish. Then raised the Ruger and fired. Single shot to the chest. Richard fell without making another sound. His wallet fell from his pocket, photos spilling across the concrete. A teenage girl smiling at a camera. A woman in a hospital bed. Evidence of a life that had just ended, a family that was about to be destroyed. Paul Vickers, the water management clerk, tried to run. Made it maybe 10 feet before Eric fired the Winchester. The shotgun blast caught him in the back, threw him forward into a stack of old wooden crates that had been sitting against the wall since the packing house closed. He didn't die immediately. Took maybe 45 seconds, making wet gasping sounds while blood pooled underneath him. Neither Mark nor Eric moved to help. Just watched until the sound stopped. George Crane, the district attorney, maintained his dignity to the end. Stopped begging, stopped negotiating, just stood straight and looked Mark in the eyes. "You're making a mistake. This won't bring your father back. This won't save your farm. All you're doing is creating more grief, more suffering, more broken families. You think you're different from men like Walter Kimbrell? You're worse. At least he hid behind laws. You're just a murderer with a rifle and a grievance." Mark considered that. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am worse. But the difference is, I'll pay for what I'm doing. I'll spend the rest of my life in prison knowing exactly what I am." Walter Kimbrell would have died in his expensive house, surrounded by grandchildren, never facing a single consequence. At least my way, there's a reckoning. He shot George Crane in the head. Wanted it to be instant, didn't want him to suffer the way Paul Vickers had suffered. Strange mercy from a man committing mass murder, but the human mind is capable of holding contradictions that would break any logical system. Thomas Morton, the real estate developer who'd made millions buying distressed farms. He'd collapsed to his knees, was praying in Spanish, repeating "Padre nuestro que estás en el cielo" over and over. Mark didn't speak Spanish well, but he knew the Lord's Prayer when he heard it, waited until Morton finished, gave him that small grace. Then fired. 4 men dead who'd been directly involved in destroying the Davis family. 4 souls who'd used the system as a weapon and discovered that systems can fail in both directions. Their deaths were murder, legally and morally. But they were also consequence. The universe balancing scales that the law had left tilted. That left 4 men. Robert Hendricks, the agricultural supply owner. The 2 strangers in working clothes who'd been playing poker and were now witnessing their own approaching executions. And the man in the Florida Gators shirt who Eric had shot in the legs, currently bleeding out slowly on the concrete floor, whimpering in pain and terror. Robert Hendricks found his voice. I didn't do anything. I wasn't part of the water rights thing. I just supply equipment. Please, I have 3 kids. I coach Little League. I volunteer at my church. I'm not like them. Please don't do this." Mark and Eric looked at each other. This was the line they'd discussed Thursday afternoon. The difference between revenge and massacre. Between justice and murder. 4 corrupt officials dead was one thing. But executing innocent men, fathers, husbands, people whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Eric spoke first, his voice shaking for the first time since they'd entered the building. "We can't let them go. They're witnesses. They'll identify us. We'll be in custody by sunrise." "I know. So what do we do?" Mark looked at Robert Hendricks, at the 2 strangers, at the wounded man bleeding on the floor, saw his father's face in each of them, saw Charles Davis dying in the dirt trying to save orange trees, saw 70 years of family history ending in corruption and paperwork. Saw Jennifer and the kids, Eric's family that was about to lose their father, because the system had failed so completely that violence became the only language left. "We finish it," Mark said quietly. "God forgive us, but we finish it." Robert Hendricks didn't beg anymore. Something in Mark's voice, in the finality of those 3 words, made him understand that pleading was pointless. Instead, he pulled out his wallet, took out a photo of 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all under 10, held it up so Mark could see. "Their names are Bobby, Matthew, and Grace. Bobby wants to be a firefighter. Matthew loves dinosaurs. Grace just started kindergarten. They're going to grow up without a father because I played poker on the wrong Thursday night. I want you to remember them. I want you to know what you're taking from the world." Mark took the photo, looked at it. 3 kids smiling at a camera, completely unaware that their father was about to die in a converted packing house because 2 brothers had been pushed past the point where moral distinctions mattered. He put the photo in his pocket. "I'll remember them, for whatever that's worth." He shot Robert Hendricks twice, once in the chest, once in the head. Wanted it fast, wanted it clean. The least he could do for a man whose only crime was knowing the wrong people and playing cards in the wrong place. The 2 strangers were next. One of them, older guy with gray hair and calloused hands, just closed his eyes and waited. The other, younger, maybe 30, started crying. Not begging, just crying, tears streaming down his face while he thought about whoever was waiting for him at home. Mark shot them both, 3 seconds apart, efficient, mechanical. The part of him that felt things had completely shut down by this point. That left the man Eric had shot, the guy in the Florida Gator shirt who'd been slowly bleeding from his leg wounds for the past 20 minutes. He'd gone quiet, probably in shock from blood loss. His face was pale, lips turning blue. He might have died on his own in another hour, but they didn't have another hour. Eric walked over to him, the .357 revolver in his hand. The man looked up at him with eyes that had gone distant, barely focusing. "Make it quick," he whispered. Eric nodded, put the revolver against the man's temple, pulled the trigger. The sound echoed in the mostly empty room, mixing with the ringing in their ears from all the previous gunshots. 8 men dead. Walter Kimbrell and 3 co-conspirators who'd earned what they got. 4 innocent men who'd died because Mark and Eric Davis couldn't figure out another way to protect themselves. Because once you start killing, the math becomes terrible. Every witness is a potential life sentence. Every survivor is a story that ends with you in a cage until you die. They stood there in the carnage they'd created, blood pooling on concrete that still smelled faintly of citrus from decades of processing oranges, shell casings scattered across the floor, 8 bodies in various states of final rest, the poker table still covered in chips and cards, and Walter Kimbrell's corpse. Mark looked at his brother. Eric was crying silently, tears streaming down his face while his hand stayed steady on the Winchester. Not crying from fear or regret exactly. Crying because some part of him understood they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd become the thing they feared most. Killers, murderers, men who'd taken 8 lives over the course of 15 minutes and would carry those deaths for whatever time remained to them. "We should go," Mark said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, flat, empty. The voice of a man who'd left something essential behind in a room full of corpses. Eric nodded. They walked toward the door, stepping carefully around blood pools, trying not to track evidence even though they both knew it didn't matter. There was no hiding this, no covering it up. Their truck was outside, their fingerprints were everywhere. By morning, every law enforcement agency in Florida would be looking for them. They made it to the door before Mark stopped, turned back, looked at the scene one more time, tried to feel something. Remorse, satisfaction, grief, anything. But there was just emptiness, just the recognition that they'd paid the price for their father's honor and currency that could never be refunded. Was it worth it? Eric asked quietly. Mark didn't answer immediately. Walked back to Walter Kimbrell's body, looked down at the man who'd killed Charles Davis through legal means and bureaucratic corruption. Thought about his father dying in the dirt, apologizing to orange trees for failing them. Thought about 3 generations of Davis family history ending in theft disguised as paperwork. Ask me in 20 years, he finally said, when we're old men in prison cells thinking about today for the 10,000th time. Ask me then if it was worth it. They left the packing house at 12:34 a.m., June 21st, 1984. Drove home through empty roads under a moonless sky. Didn't speak, didn't turn on the radio, just drove. 2 brothers who'd sacrificed everything for revenge that felt increasingly hollow with every mile. They made it home by 1:15 a.m., parked the truck in the barn, unloaded the weapons, wiped everything down, even though wiping down evidence was pointless at this stage, burned their clothes in the same barrel where they'd burned trash for decades, stood there watching fabric turn to ash while the reality of what they'd done started penetrating the shock. Mark went inside, took a shower that lasted 40 minutes, trying to wash away something that soap and water couldn't touch. Got dressed in clean clothes, sat on the back porch with a beer, and waited for dawn. Eric sat beside him. Neither of them drank much, just held the bottles, watched the sky lighten over 500 acres of dying orange trees that would outlive them both. "Jennifer's going to hate me," Eric said around 4 a.m., first words either of them had spoken since leaving the packing house. "Jennifer's going to be devastated, but she'll understand eventually. Maybe not forgive, but understand." Mark paused. "You should call her. Tell her you love her. Tell the kids you love them, before the police come." Eric made the call at 5:30, woke Jennifer up, told her something terrible had happened, that he was sorry, that she needed to take the kids and go stay with her sister in Georgia for a while. Didn't explain details because some things you can't explain over the phone. Just said, "I love you" 3 times and hung up before she could ask questions that didn't have good answers. The police arrived at 7:42 a.m. 3 sheriff's cruisers, 2 unmarked FBI vehicles, and SWAT van because they didn't know if the suspects would resist. Found Mark and Eric sitting on the porch, hands visible, no weapons in sight, completely cooperative. Sheriff Mike Carson, who'd gone to high school with Charles Davis, who'd attended the funeral 2 days ago, walked up the porch steps with his service weapon drawn, but pointed at the ground. "Mark, Eric, need you both to stand up slowly, hands where I can see them." They stood. Let themselves be handcuffed, didn't resist, didn't speak, except when Mark said, "There's a letter on the kitchen table. Explains everything. You'll want to read it before the FBI starts asking questions." The letter was 7 pages, handwritten, explaining the water rights theft, Charles's death, the complete failure of every legal channel, the decision to take matters into their own hands. Mark had written it Thursday afternoon before they'd gone to the packing house. Not a confession exactly, more like a manifesto, an explanation for why 8 men had to die. The FBI investigation lasted 3 weeks. Special Agent Rebecca Morrison led it. Thorough and professional, built a case so airtight that even the best defense attorneys couldn't find cracks. Fingerprints, ballistics, witness statements from people who'd seen Mark and Eric's truck leaving the area. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The confessions were voluntary and detailed. But something strange happened during the investigation. As agents dug into Walter Kimbrell's activities, into the water management office, into the network of corruption that had operated in Highlands County for years, they found evidence of systematic fraud. Dozens of families scammed the same way as the Davises. Millions of dollars in stolen water rights, manipulated permits, fraudulent documentation. Agent Morrison's final report noted, While the actions of Mark and Eric Davis constitute premeditated murder and cannot be legally justified, the investigation revealed extensive corruption within county government that appears to have directly caused Charles Davis's death and the destruction of the Davis family farm. The legal system failed these defendants at every level prior to their criminal actions. The trial started January 8, 1985, in Fort Myers Federal Court. Prosecutor was Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen, who argued for multiple consecutive life sentences without parole. The defense attorney was Margaret Sullivan, a civil rights lawyer who'd made her name defending unpopular clients. She didn't dispute the facts. Couldn't. Instead, she argued that the system's complete failure created a form of temporary insanity that men pushed beyond all reasonable limits cannot be judged by normal standards. The jury deliberated for 6 days, came back with guilty verdicts on all 8 counts of first-degree murder. But they also submitted an unusual petition requesting judicial mercy, citing extraordinary circumstances and systematic government corruption. Judge William Patterson, 63 years old, 30 years on the bench, spent 4 days before sentencing. His statement from the bench lasted 40 minutes. The key part: the defendants committed heinous crimes. They took 8 lives, including 4 men who bore no responsibility for their grievances. However, this court recognizes that the defendants were driven to these actions by a level of systematic corruption and legal failure that represents a complete breakdown of the social contract. While I cannot condone their actions, I can acknowledge the circumstances that created them. He sentenced Mark and Eric each to 8 consecutive life terms, but made them eligible for parole after serving 30 years. Not mercy exactly, but recognition that the world isn't black and white, that justice sometimes exists in impossible gray spaces where law and morality pull in different directions. Mark Davis died in prison at Florida State Penitentiary on November 3, 2019, at age 71. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 6 months earlier, refused all treatment beyond pain management. He'd served 35 years, been eligible for parole 5 times, refused to apply each time. His last words to the prison chaplain: "I saved my family's honor but lost my soul. Would I do it again? Yes. Does that make it right? No." Those 2 truths live together, and there's no resolving them. Eric Davis is still alive as I record this in 2024, 72 years old, serving his sentence at the same facility. He applied for parole once in 2014, was denied. Hasn't applied since. His daughter Sarah visits twice a year, now 43 years old with kids of her own who've never met their grandfather outside prison walls. His son Michael changed his last name to his mother's maiden name, hasn't spoken to Eric since 1991. Jennifer divorced Eric in 1987, remarried in 1990 to a high school teacher named David, had a good life by all accounts. She died in 2017, never visited Eric in prison after the first year. Can't blame her for that. What do you say to a husband who murdered 8 people, even if 4 of them probably deserved it? The Davis family farm was sold at auction in 1985. A corporate citrus operation bought it for $340,000 and bulldozed most of the orange trees, replanted with more profitable varieties. Changed hands 3 more times since then. Current owners are an agricultural investment fund based in Brazil. The house where 3 generations of Davises lived was demolished in 1993. Nothing remains except a concrete foundation slowly being reclaimed by Florida vegetation. Walter Kimbrell's corruption network unraveled after his death. The FBI investigation expanded, eventually charging 12 county and state officials with various fraud counts. Most took plea deals, served minimal time, got on with their lives. The water rights were redistributed, many families got their allocations restored. But that happened too late for the Davises and didn't bring back the 8 men who died in the Sunbright packing house. The packing house itself burned down in 1997, arson suspected, but never proven. Local teenagers probably, smoking where they shouldn't have been. The lot sat empty for years, was eventually bought by a strip mall developer. Now it's a public supermarket, a nail salon, a Verizon store. People shop there every day, completely unaware that 8 men died on that spot in the name of justice that couldn't find legal channels. Here's the thing about this story that should make all of us uncomfortable. Mark and Eric Davis weren't monsters. They were ordinary men pushed into extraordinary circumstances by a system that completely failed them. Their father was killed, legally but deliberately, through corruption that wore suits and ties and used paperwork instead of weapons. And when they tried every proper channel, every official route, they discovered that the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, just not for people like them. Does that justify what they did? Absolutely not. They murdered 8 people. They destroyed families, created orphans, turned themselves into the very thing they claimed to hate. 4 of their victims were innocent men who died simply for witnessing the wrong crime. There's no moral framework where that's acceptable. But if we're honest, if we're really honest, we have to ask ourselves some hard questions. What happens when legal systems become weapons? What happens when corruption operates within the bounds of law? What happens when every proper channel fails? And desperate people are left with nothing but desperate choices? The Davis brothers crossed a line that should never be crossed, but that line existed in a landscape where authorities couldn't or wouldn't protect, where criminals operated legally, where a dying father's humiliation went unpunished, where an honest family facing ruin had nowhere to turn. This isn't a story with heroes. Charles Davis loved his family but trusted the wrong person. Walter Kimbrell and his associates were predators who used law as camouflage. Mark and Eric Davis became killers in the name of justice. 8 dead men, some corrupt, some complicit, some innocent, all destroyed by a cascade of failures, human and institutional. The real tragedy is this pattern continues. Every year, families face impossible situations when systems fail them. Every year, somewhere in America, someone decides that legal channels have failed, that honor demands blood, that protecting family requires becoming what you fear most. The names change, the details shift, but the fundamental question remains: what happens when ordinary people are pushed past all reasonable limits? When does the victim become the villain? When does justice become murder? I want to be absolutely clear about something. Violence is not the answer. Revenge doesn't heal wounds, doesn't bring back the dead, doesn't solve the underlying problems. Mark and Eric Davis destroyed 8 families trying to save one. They spent decades in prison thinking about those 15 minutes every single day. They lost everything: their freedom, their family, their future, and gained nothing except the bitter knowledge that revenge tastes like ashes. If you find yourself in an impossible situation, if you feel like the system has failed you completely, please understand, there are always other options: legal aid organizations, investigative journalists, advocacy groups, civil rights attorneys. The path Mark and Eric chose led only to more suffering, more death, more broken families on both sides. The line between justice and vengeance is clear, even when it doesn't feel that way in moments of rage and grief. Cross that line and you don't become a hero standing up to corruption. You become a murderer, plain and simple, regardless of your reasons. The Davis brothers learned that lesson at a cost that can never be repaid. If this story made you think about justice, corruption, systematic failure, and the terrible things ordinary people are capable of when pushed beyond breaking points, please leave your like on this video and subscribe to this channel for more true stories that explore the darkest corners of human nature and the impossible choices real people face. But more importantly, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Where do you draw the line between justified revenge and unforgivable murder? If you were in Mark Davis's position, father dead from systematic corruption, legal system completely failed, farm being stolen through fraud, what would you have done? Is there ever a circumstance where taking the law into your own hands is justified? Or is violence always wrong regardless of provocation? These aren't easy questions. They don't have comfortable answers. But they're questions we need to ask because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now, somewhere, to someone whose name we don't know yet. And maybe by wrestling with these impossible questions, we can build systems that work better, that protect people instead of failing them, that make violence unnecessary instead of inevitable. Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made, one failed system, one corrupt official, one desperate decision at a time. And sometimes the line between hero and villain disappears entirely, leaving only blood and questions and broken families on both sides of an equation that never balances.